They put me on as moderator because I can employ tactical disrespect, even towards 4 stars. So I can hopefully keep things lively with your help, because this is ultimately about this discussion with a very educated, very passionate, very well-informed audience. We're going to try to leave a lot of time for your questions, so grab those cards. General Murray, well, we may throw some things his way too. But General Murray already gave a pretty good introduction to the panel, so I'll just go through very briefly. We have General Brown from USARPAC, which is really on the cutting edge of a lot of things in testing out these concepts and technologies in one of the most urgent theaters, multi-domain task force, the I2Q's long-range targeting and intelligence unit. We have Lieutenant General Wesley, the artist formerly known as ARCIC, now Futures and Concept Center, which is one of the least awful acronyms to come out of this reorganization. He's very lucky. Who's really been sort of the intellectual conductor of the symphony of multi-domain, which is really the intellectual framework for all of this that we're working on. We have, to keep us honest and not forget history and not let it repeat itself, we have Dr. Johnson, not the one from the Renaissance, but pretty smart too, and my former grad school teacher. And as our, I think you're our youngest and snarkiest member, Mr. Rodriguez, who has done a lot of work in AI, in wargaming, and can really talk about, you know, not just the tech, but how it plugs into some of these wider concepts and some of these profound trends we're facing. And rather than rattle off their resumes, I'll let them speak for themselves, and I will glare at them if they take more than a few minutes.
All right, I think I'm kicking it off. Thanks, Sydney. You know, Mike Murray did a great job of really tackling what's changed, and I'll just a few areas to highlight as well. When you look at the complexity, I think probably every generation thinks their time is the most complex, but it's pretty hard to argue that the velocity of human interaction hasn't picked up to a level as like any unseen before in history. I mean, I just think of who would have thought a few years ago a tweet could go around the world in seconds and cause such reaction. And that's, as you look, has caused some challenges. The fog of war 10, 15 years ago was not enough information, and for many, many years. Now the fog of war is overwhelming amounts of information. And the same thing, of course, hitting many areas. You know, when you look, we had a fundamental change in 2008. We had more folks, more things connected to the internet than there are people on Earth. And this has definitely had a huge impact. It's created a hyper-competition, the return of near-peer competition. Now, I want to emphasize competition does not need to be conflict, but there is a hyper-competition. You know, phase 0 was a phase we used to talk about. Never liked that term in the first place. It implied nothing was happening. Boy, stuff is happening all the time now as we look. And and also mentioned earlier the A2AD problems, long-range precision. As former Secretary of Defense Mattis said, we definitely had a period where we had a little bit of strategic atrophy there, and it's caused issues. So multi-domain operations, we've been very fortunate in the Pacific to lead a 2-year, now going on 2-year pilot study on multi-domain operations, and we're really discovering quite a bit as we look at it. It's an evolutionary process, but certainly revolutionary impact. And we, you know, as you look back, the period after Vietnam and air-land battle took about 14 years to go from concept to doctrine. I was a young company commander and folded gap responsibilities in 4th Infantry Division, and I remember things like fight outnumbered and win, the big 5 that helped us, in essence, defeat the Soviets without having to fight in the Cold War because of that effort. As we look at multi-domain operations, evolutionary, air, land, sea, but cyber and space, huge parts of it as well. We don't have 14 years to go from concept to doctrine. And we're seeing very quickly a lot of the concept emerging into doctrine right away. For example, convergence. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, hopefully in some of the questions, where you're pulling capabilities together, an integration, a joint integration, including multinational capabilities in all domains that will help you optimize effects and overmatch through cross-domain synergy. Now, one form that we've had is within multi-domain operations. One effort we've had is a multi-domain task force, and I look forward to talking about that in detail, but essentially it is a maneuver element with a central brains of the operation, if you will, the I2Qs, information, intelligence, information, cyber, electronic warfare, and space. And we're seeing great impact of that as we test it out in exercises, TTXs, war games, simulations, another area that about a month ago we formed the first I2Qs battalion, and this year we'll have, later this year, we'll have the multi-domain task force in the Pacific in an operation. So I look forward to talking more about where we've gone, the key advantages of multi-domain operations, and absolutely, without a doubt, it is the future and it is the answer, the next air-land battle, if you will. So look forward to your questions and talking more about this. I don't want Sydney to bump me off the stage. I'm already over time, but look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's 4 stars, 4 minutes. I'll give you a little leeway. General Wesley, eyeing your stars on your shoulder, fire away.
Thanks, Sydney. So before I start, I want to compliment General Brown on his dashing sartorial taste. Give him a hand. He's the best looking one up here, I think. He set us all at a disadvantage. Earlier, we decided as part of this panel that we would keep our, our opening remarks short so we could engender a vigorous debate and include questions. So the narrow area I want to talk about right now is to complement what General Murray talked about earlier in terms of what has changed. We're talking about the changing character of war in this panel. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions. And everything General Murray said is correct, but as it relates to multi-domain operations, I wanted to focus in on 3 operational level issues that have changed, but at the strategic level, we would start with saying that there's 2 things. One is you've got a revanchist Russia who is demonstrating a much more aggressive behavior, not only in Europe, but beyond, as we've seen even in Syria and otherwise. The second area is an unprecedented economic expansion on the part of China. And both of those things set up an environment that leads me to the 3 operational variables or factors that forced us to develop and write the concept that we're pursuing, multi-domain operations. We didn't write multi-domain operations because we thought it was neat. We wrote that the way we did because there are specific problems posed by these changes. The first is our peers watched how we fight both in 91 and 2003. They want no part of close combat with the United States or partners and our allies, and so they invested in multiple layers of standoff. And synergistically, or rather, as would happen, we happened to redeploy from both the continent and the peninsula at the same time, which further enhanced their investment in multiple layers of standoff. The second one is they've sought to challenge us in all domains. They don't want to cede the domains that we've been used to having for the last 30 years. So the idea of deploying at will without interference, communicating at will without interference is gone. So they have now been able to invest asymmetrically in the domains that will now cause us problems. And the final, and probably the most strategically challenging for the United States in particular, but also Western democracies, is this idea of leveraging the competition space. So what they've been able to do is achieve their operational and strategic objectives in fait accompli victories that have diluted the deterrent effect that we've relied on for the last 50 or 60 years. So getting into that space, if the United States or partners and allies do not get into the competition space, we will find that our deterrent effect and our ability to achieve our strategic and operational objectives over time will continue to diminish. So I look forward to your questions. I think I was just over 3 minutes.
I'll forgive you. Dr. Johnson.
Thanks for having me here today. Let me start by saying I believe that the Army's MDO concept has matured significantly over the past year. What I want to talk about today, however, the remaining challenges to achieving a joint concept. There's important work ongoing between the Army and the Air Force, as shown in this graphic from an article by then TRADOC Commander General Perkins and General Holmes from Air Combat Command that depicts the convergence of Army and Air Force concepts. Nevertheless, I believe there are issues that remain about how each service believes wars are won that must be reconciled to move toward a joint, much less a whole-of-government MDO concept. Next slide. Fundamentally, the Army is about offensive operations to defeat and destroy enemy forces and seize terrain, resources, and population centers. To do this, we've always used essentially an outside-in approach, as shown in the bottom left graphic from the current operations field manual. Next slide. The Air Force, since before World War II, has believed that air power is the strategic war-winning instrument. It has employed an inside-out approach with the heart of the enemy state as the first priority. Daylight strategic bombing in Germany's industrial web during World War II, Colonel John Warden's 5 rings targeting approach for Desert Storm, and the Air Force's current concept all have at their core a belief that the Air Force can be the decisive service in war. Next slide. I believe that the last time the Army and the Air Force cooperated closely in a fight against a peer enemy was in World War II. Unfortunately, each theater, air, and ground commanders like those shown in this picture from Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group had to figure this out in combat on the ground because there never was any institutional guidance, much less doctrine. And after the war, even this ad hoc collaboration largely ended with the Air Force's independence. Nevertheless, as the 12th Army Group After Action Report noted after the war, quote, the Air Armor Team is a most powerful combination. The use of this coordinated force in combat should be habitual, unquote. The challenge now is how to create this most powerful combination across domains with multiple services, departments, and agencies. Next chart. I'll close with one example when I believe the Army and the Air Force collaborated at an institutional level. This is, as we've heard before, after the '73 Yom Kippur War, which showed how far Soviet capabilities advanced while the United States was focused on the Vietnam War. This created what I call a shared problem in NATO that neither service could solve independently. And eventually it resulted in the 31 initiatives to address the Soviet challenge. Unfortunately, this collaboration frayed with the end of the Cold War. However, I believe there are really some important lessons from that era that can be useful in solving the two shared problems that we have to solve now, China and Russia. And I believe Army-Air Force cooperation is the critical path to achieving the important objectives laid out in the Army's multi-domain operations concept. But there also needs to be a joint concept to force comprehensive progress, and so far such a concept is missing in action. Thanks for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
And Mr. Rodriguez.
Well, it's great to be here. It's also nice to see General Brown wearing the pinks and greens. I wore those as a cadet at Texas A&M, and proof yet again that if you wait around long enough, things eventually come back into fashion. So I figured I'd start off with a brief anecdote. I grew up son of a military officer, and we were in Berlin, Germany, as the Berlin Brigade was being shut down and driving out of our little narrow street that we lived on. And a bunch of old German women were out there waving their handkerchiefs, crying and, waving us off. And I turned to my mom and dad in the car and I said, I didn't know, Germans, or German women in this case, I didn't know they were all that sentimental. And my dad said, well, they're not crying because of you, son. They're crying or they're upset because they're terrified that the Russians are going to come back. This was obviously 1994, about the, and I guess I'm dating myself standing next to at least Dave here. And what this shows, and this slide is designed to show as well, is that in the last almost 30 years now, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, we have been beset by a rapidly evolving threat environment. Remember the good old days of long-range precision fires and or precision strike and mobility? What we've seen now is a time where American dominance has been overtaken by multiple overlapping and at times competing mission requirements. Counterinsurgency was just the bow wave as our adversaries took their time to work inside our strategy. Little green men, the pronounced return of disinformatia, active measures, and now AI-enabled autonomous weapons pose critical offset dilemmas that are forcing us to make hard choices, and these are choices we must make, or else they will be imposed upon us. Next slide. So what I tried to do in this brief discussion is also show a couple implications for industry. This is requiring the U.S. Army, as well as its associated industrial base, to adapt, including new concepts such as, and these are my words, multidimensional innovation, adapting to commercially minded adversaries, and coping with, as former Deputy Secretary Bob Work said, endemic surprise. These are going to tax us profoundly, and especially in a period of tight technological competition, it's important to calibrate the way and the timing that we roll out this quote-unquote innovation. Our British allies confronted this against the Weimar Republic and the Third Reich to great effect, even if it meant sacrificing tactical objectives. Slide. What I tried to characterize is what I call the 4 revolutions. I'll let you read these, and we can talk more about the technologies associated with them later. But the difficulty is we get caught up in technological buzzwords. AI, blockchain, hypersonics. At some point, some smart defense contractor will find a way to jam all these things together in a solution that we can consider buying, probably through an OTA. These 4 revolutions attempt to make sense of the concepts and the technology themselves with an overlaying rhythm of information, what we call data security. Again, you don't get AI if you don't have the data, and the data we have right now in many cases is not secure, at rest, or in motion. Final slide. Adapting to our industrial base is going to require us to have what I call an always in beta mindset. If you're unsure what this means, pull out your smartphone for Exhibit A. I don't have, well, I guess I'm already wearing my glasses, so I can't pull Under Secretary McCarthy. This involves reassessing how we engage the commercial sector in prime sub relationships. It involves rethinking the risk tolerance that industry and its government customers are accustomed to accepting. And most of all, it involves having a clear understanding, and this echoes General Murray, our technology supply chain down to the 3rd and 4th tier as it flies out the door to other countries.
Thanks. And I will cut you off there so we can get to the already growing stack of questions we have. Let me start with one for the 2 generals primarily. Multi-domain operations is fairly new, but has been evolving rapidly. You've been doing experimentation and war games. What have been the surprises? What have been the things you went, okay, we came in with concept A, but now we actually have bounced off, reality, or at least simulated reality, and we need actually A prime, or maybe B, or Z. Where have you, changed direction or filled in things that were big blanks? General Brown, since you've been doing this in the field?
Yeah, no, thanks, Sidney. That's a great question. And that has occurred. And the good news is, as we've been doing this, it hasn't been on our own. TRADOC has been right there with us, now Army Futures Command, AMC, from the very beginning. And so we can learn, capture the lessons, and share it with others. So just a couple. First of all, I mentioned the I2Qs. It's part of the Multi-Domain Task Force. Multi-Domain Task Force is a maneuver formation. Initially we thought kind of more in line of a strategic fire cell. We realized it must be able to maneuver to a position of relative advantage, not to close with and destroy the enemy, but to affect the enemy in all domains. And another surprise that has been validated in exercises, training, simulations, and then by folks outside OSD and others as well is the survivability on land. I guess shouldn't be a surprise to any of us. Land is much different than air and at sea. There are places you can certainly hide in caves, jungles, mountains, deserts, the variety on land, but a small formation that is maneuverable is highly survivable, and this is proven over and over again. Another one would be the I2Qs we talked about in the MDTF, Intel, Information, Cyber, Electronic Warfare, and Space, that during the competition phase, it is there and can be engaged. Now, we knew it would be very powerful if we got to crisis or conflict. But during competition, you can set things up to return to competition if it goes to a crisis, and if it goes to a conflict. What you've done in competition can help you. It's very similar to what General Wesley was talking about, the fait accompli in that gray zone, that those adversaries that would do us harm are working particular things. Well, you can also work things in the competition phase when you have that element forward, able to compete. I think another one is A2AD umbrella and the whole idea of convergence that came out of the concept. Very well written and takes incredible joint integration, but we've seen it in numerous exercises so far. I'll give you an example in Yamasakura exercise, defense of Japan, working with our close allies in Japan back in December, and using the I2Q's multi-domain task force element that was forward, we were able to, in the competition phase, set some things up that as we went to crisis, enabled the capabilities of the adversary, in this case, surface-to-air missile radars, to be exploited, and then several other domains were able to destroy those assets, demonstrating the convergence that was in the concept. And this back and forth in multiple domains to a position of relative advantage, a maneuver, if you will, in all domains, very, very effective. Finally, I would say the other surprise has been, you have to have the ability to defeat an adversary, A2AD, anti-access aerial denial capability. But you also establish your own local A2AD that's been very powerful and helped maneuver in multiple domains. And we find that, in particular, Air Force and Navy are very grateful for that and can do quite a bit as we're working this concept. So those are just a few. We're capturing them all. Sharing them all. I will compliment General Wesley, even though he's in a very old uniform, very boring. But I'll compliment him on just incredible work on these concepts that are very quickly going to doctrine, and plans are already changing at combatant command level because of that. So tremendous work, and we'll get him one of these new uniforms here eventually.
Before we go to General Leslie, you actually set me up for one of the follow-up questions, which is MDTF a maneuver formation, a fires formation, or is that distinction too artificial now?
Yeah, I would say that distinction. Everybody wants to say it's maneuver or fires. It's both, but it must be able to maneuver to a position of relative advantage. You must be able to maneuver, and that applies whether it's in a Pacific scenario on one of 25,000 islands. I mean, if you look at history, I know David will, in World War II, we had 6 corps and 22 U.S. divisions in the Pacific on islands. And it's very fascinating. Just give you, it was air and maritime that enabled the land to leapfrog and gain more access and more airfields to continue movement across the Pacific. Now, it's a little bit reversed. It's land that will enable air and maritime as well as cyber and space with land in certain circumstances to enable that maneuver. And so it is a maneuver, but the long-range precision fires portion of it are critical. So it's both, and it is a new concept, and you can't just put it in a box of one or the other.
Sidney, I'm going to talk about two. You point out MDO. One of the reasons I want to highlight these two, and the fact that we've learned some things is reflective of MDO as in its state right now. When we first, the difference between MDB and MDO is the rigor and the degree to which we learned over a very short period of time the necessary things that we need to do to solve the problems that exist. So two that I'll mention. First is when we first started out on this, I think there was a good portion of the Army that was seeing the capacity of the brigades, and because capabilities tend to migrate downward over time, and you could leverage extreme lethality from BCTs. And our experience with BCTs over the last 10 years is that you would have this idea of independent brigades, and that with technology and lethality and maneuverability that these brigades could sustain themselves independently, and what we learned is that is not possible. That we have to reestablish and rebuild a campaign formation at echelons above brigade, because organic to the brigade, you cannot afford to put all the capabilities you would need in that formation one, and the BCT commander couldn't simultaneously solve the problems that you see up on the screen there in terms of competing in the theater, penetrating, disintegrating their systems, and then the exploitation. So we knew we had to, one, rebuild echelons above brigade, and that is fundamental to the concept, which brings me to the second point. A lot of people will say, well, MDO just adds a few more domains. It's air-land battle with extra domains, and that couldn't be further from the truth. And just to clarify, this is what we learned. Number one, the fact is you do need to integrate domains in order to create overmatch, because our peers have invested in the domains and not ceded them to us. So the way you get overmatch is you've got to stack those domains in order to synchronize it in such a way that the total is greater than the sum of the parts. But it's not just the domains that makes this different. You know, with air-land battle, we had interior lines, and the problem was you had to fight outnumbered and win and defeat the second echelon. That's not the problem we have today. The problem is these multiple layers of standoff that we have to penetrate in order to disintegrate those systems and get to the position of advantage. So that brings me back to point one. The headquarters that do that are the echelons above brigade, and they must be present. They must be present, as General Brown mentioned, in order to have the effect that you want to achieve and a certain amount of the maneuver force. So what we've learned is, and this is the tough challenge that I think we're all going to have to embrace, this will be a political question and it'll be an Army question, and that is, what does calibrated force posture look like? It's one of the tenets of multi-domain operations. But part of it is presence, being in the theater to be able to conduct the tasks that we talked about earlier. And that can be a combination of rotational forces, expeditionary capability, national assets, and authorities. But at some point, I'm convinced we're going to have to wrestle with the question of the degree to which we have forces deployed in both the European continent and the Pacific theater.
Understood. Well, thank you. To throw it down to the suit wearing end of the table, Freedom. I mean, as you look at these big trends, you know, over history that both of you have studied from different angles, what's different about this iteration? You know, this RMA or transformation or whatever the deprecated term is. You know, yes, we can learn lessons from history, but where are the places where this is to some degree unprecedented in the challenges the Army's facing?
Okay. Sure. So technology follows epidemiological trends. It does not scale linearly. So various technologies basically kind of ink blot into adjacent technology areas. This is why we're seeing confluences with AI and autonomous systems, as an example, or quantum computing and electronic warfare. So the challenge in this is it makes it very, very difficult to track and develop concepts and capabilities and mission sets that respond to these technology developments, because they're not following a linear track. It's not like you get AI 1.0 and then AI 2.0 then AI 3.0. It's having an exponential effect. So this makes it very, very difficult to counter. At the same time, and I'll dovetail off what I said earlier, we are in, and this is important to emphasize, we are in a period of tight technological competition, much like, as I think the best example is an example I used earlier, what the British did, the Royal Navy specifically did with their Dreadnought class ships against the Weimar Republic in World War I. They had this design 30 years in advance and literally told the guy that developed it, keep that in your hip pocket. And they held it in reserve even at the Battle of Jutland, where they, this is a major fight, and they hold their two Dreadnought class ships in reserve. So why am I telling you all this? I'm glad you asked. The challenge that we have to think about today when it comes to technology is not just the technology itself, but the processes and the policies at the Army level and at the Department of Defense level that are going to allow us to employ this capability that General Brown and General Wesley are talking about. And the reason why that matters is our adversaries know this. They have zero desire in seeing our incredible sergeants and lieutenants ever get close to them. So they're going to keep us way the hell away. And that's a big, big problem that I think we have a share of the task in. But this gets to a question earlier about the joint force, and thank goodness we have General Wesley here working that with organizations like Air Force Warfighting Integration Center, AFWIC, because everyone else knows that this is the concept of A2AD strategically. They have zero desire in letting any of us and any of our cool kit ever reach their shores.
Yeah, and let me pull on two threads you mentioned there. And then we'll go to Dr. Johnson. One is that, it's not just a moving target technologically, it is a metastasizing target. It's like a cancer. It spreads, it changes form. You can't just say, we have a count, it's not a simple measure, countermeasure, countermeasure, because things multiply in ways that are not that easily boxed up. And the second thing you mentioned was, keeping some capabilities in your pocket behind the curtain. One of the questions that's come up is, how do you do that when we have this massive tech transfer, not only voluntary as part of the global economy, which we're defending, that creates opportunity for our people, but as part of the vast shoplifting of the Chinese and others?
I think the way to do it is you approach it from a software basis and not necessarily a hardware basis. Okay. I think the software and the commercial world does this all the time. Right, that was my comment about being always in beta and positive control of technology. Positive control of technology means you have to share to a certain degree, but you make sure that you keep your IP close to you. I think we're being forced to do this, and this is going to be the challenge when you talk about engaging commercial vendors, right? I'm not talking about a defense industrial player that now has an innovation floor. I'm talking about a true commercial player and integrating them within the defense industrial base. Look, the defense industrial base, their superpower, so I've been a venture capitalist and through a series of poor life choices an entrepreneur as well. The challenge is that the defense industrial base gets a bad rap. What their superpower in the startup world, that's what we call these things, superpowers, their superpower is scale, being able to scale massively complex, difficult, large-scale projects and delivering them with a high degree of quality, time and time again. And that should be, I think, advertised much more than whether or not they have the latest bleeding edge, neural network application.
Understood. Dr. Johnson, you've been very patient. Fire away.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about what I think is not new. And that is that every time there is a shift in technology that is radical or potentially radical, everybody knows it's there. Atomic weapons, it was a race, an engineering race, not a science race necessarily. So I think it's, we all know everything's different, everything's complex, everything's fast, all these things have always been true, and every society is facing radical change. The most complicated engine in World War II was the B-29 engine, which is much more complex than a jet engine. It's part of the reason we like jet engines. But I think the issue is, what do you do with what you see? Mm-hmm. And I think Eric's point that I think is really important and work that Futures Command is doing, you can't innovate to solve a problem if you don't have a problem. And so what is it you're trying to do with these technologies that have application to solving the problem the Army has to deliver in competition and in war? I think the national defense strategy is extremely important in this regard. So we're not thinking about somebody someday somewhere. We know who it is, two people, two groups, where they are, Europe, Pacific, and what their capabilities are. Everyone in between 1920 and 1940 knew about tanks, airplanes, and radios. The only country in the world that combined them into something useful, the Blitzkrieg, was the Germans, because they still had to solve the problem of knocking France out. They tried it twice by trying to walk to Paris. That didn't work, and mechanization solved the problem they had. So that just a rigorous focus, not on the solutions, but what are the problems that I need solutions to help me solve, I think is the way we need to go.
Mm-hmm. And to bring it back to you gentlemen, talk about the problem. and how it differs in the two theaters. You know, let's name names: Russia and China, the things we're worried about. That's in the NDS. What are the most worrying things that we have to deal with? The assassin's maces, perhaps, as the Chinese doctrine puts them, and what are their vulnerabilities that we can exploit?
Let me set this one up, sir, and then I'll pass it to you because you can cite the differences in the Pacific. But so we're clear. When we drafted MDO, we decided that we were going to build it off of a pacing threat, which is the first time we'd done that, as Dr. Johnson mentioned, in decades, frankly. And that pacing threat initially, based on the defense planning guidance, et cetera, was oriented on Russia, the near-term problem. But it was clear that we could see on the horizon a significant threat with China, and as you see our senior leadership, it's even becoming more pressing. So we looked at the two problems, both China and Russia, and we said, a good concept is one that you're going to build the army against, and you'll have it for a good long time. And so if there's any universalities between the two threats, could we identify them, recognizing that the premier threat that we were focusing on was Russia? And that's the virtue of, it also is linked to the last question that Sydney asked, and that is, do you get far enough out with your concept so that it remains relevant? And the way you do that is you figure out the framework, the intellectual framework that you're going to build the Army around, which is the problems, and can you make it broad enough such that those problems are relevant? And that's what MDO is. And what we concluded was that the two countries, Russia and China, are different. But they're similar enough, they're sufficiently similar to build a concept against, orienting on Russia, and then over time, as you watch China, you can divert your investments or adjust the technical aspects of the solution to that threat. So we believe that both China and Russia, the similarities are that they do want to expand the competition space and achieve their objectives left of conflict. Both countries want to do that. They do both agree that they don't want to engage in close combat and therefore have invested in the multiple layers of standoff. So these problems are similar, but as you point out, Sydney, there are some distinctions in the Pacific, and given that MDO is built around Russia, it would be appropriate for General Brown to talk about China. And
one of the obvious differences is the maritime aspect. China has been investing heavily in their Navy. Our advantage, we have the best Navy in the world. China's long-range precision fighters want to keep them out of, clearly, the first island chain. They'd be happy to keep them out of the second island chain as well. So that's where we see multi-domain operations, that joint integration, working together. If you think about China's ships, for example, trying to hug the littorals to avoid the advantage we have at sea, and a multi-domain task force using multi-domain operations, and again, present during the competition phase to set up some of those key areas and domains like cyber and space, but could push the Chinese assets into essentially the kill zone for the U.S. Navy to destroy them. And this is very similar in air as well. So clearly China, as you look, has made an incredible investment and really building to try to present such a key A2AD umbrella that we can't get close, as General Wesley mentioned. There's a couple other things that are key in that. One huge advantage we had was mentioned earlier by Mike Murray and the under, our allies and partners. Mm-hmm. Allies and partners are key. We, 5 of our 7 allies in the world are in the Pacific. And we have tremendous allies and partners that working closely together, that presents quite a dilemma. Another key for us advantage that Mike Murray mentioned is clearly our soldiers who can be empowered, and that mission command philosophy that empowers those soldiers and those leaders to take the initiative, and that will be critical in multi-domain operations. You cannot have an individual that's micromanaged, has to come back up and check consistently. It's going to be understanding the commander's intent, mission command, and out there, no question about it, empowered and able to react faster than those they would be going against. So those are just some of those key areas.
I mean, if you're used to pulling out your cell phone and calling your boss every time you have to go left instead of right, that's not going to work once the Chinese and Russians get to our systems. So it's not just it's good to have initiatives. You may have no way to check. And if you're used to micromanaging or being micromanaged, you may not have the tools to do that because those domains are contested and may be denied.
That's a great point. It's why this whole effort is focused on readiness and multi-domain operations. One of those keys to readiness is working in degraded mode. You're going to be degraded in some way, shape, or form, and if you're not training that and working that, then it's not going to be a good outcome if you have to do it for real. So that is absolutely key. You know, there are those that will say the network will never fail. That's just not realistic. There's no network that's going to be 100% of the time effective. Now, for key periods, yes, but certainly you've got to work that degraded mode, and that's where empowerment comes in even more.
Yeah, Cindy, one small point just to add to that. This is one of the reasons we need a joint concept, and that is the differences in the theater. So, very quick example, you're not going to use submarines to penetrate in the European theater, right? You're going to use fires and air to a degree initially, but in the Pacific, you have a completely different approach, and without a common framework or understanding of how we're going to fight, that not only enhances the distinction of the theaters, but identifies the commonality, then we will have a difficult time coming together as a joint force.
Great point. Understood. And let me add, actually, Britt said one of the questions that's come up several times, and I'm interested in everyone's take on this. I mean, okay, allies and jointness are sort of our great asymmetrical advantages, our ability to pull these things together across DoD with some kicking and screaming, and with our allies and partners with even more kicking and screaming. To what point can we do a division of labor? I mean, a lot of this is about, we can't rely on the Air Force to provide us 24/7 hot and cold running close air support anymore. A lot of this is about we can't rely on having a handy Kuwait to base in and build up in for 6 months anymore. But are there things in MDO we can safely, because we can't buy everything ourselves, we can safely offload to partners and say, you guys set up a local A2AD bubble or something like that. Dr. Johnson, you have a thought there.
Yeah, so I think what I sense when I go to every one of these sessions with different services, that every service thinks they're the supported service. And so, what is Air going to do for Army MDO in the theater? And that's not the Army's challenge in writing a concept. It is a natural predilection of someone trying to solve their problem. But I think what we need to do as a service and all services is focus on, what do the services actually believe they're supposed to do? And I think this goes back to, I'll just give you one historical example, although I probably have two. So at the end of World War II, how are you going to defeat Japan? The Navy says we're going to blockade Japan, there's no maritime shipping come in, and we're going to starve them to death and they'll surrender. Curtis LeMay, who had come from 8th Air Force in Europe to lead the bombing campaign with B-29s, said we're going to end the war when every Japanese city is burned to the ground. They asked General MacArthur, what are you going to do? Well, the only way you can solve this problem is land invasion. And eventually, MacArthur had a lot of sway, and the plan was Operation Downfall, which is the ground invasion, with a lot of joint support into Japan. And then the atomic bomb became available. I found a cable back from General Marshall to General Spotts, who was an Air Force commander in the Pacific. And he said, I'm really concerned about you talking to the press about the atomic bomb shows that there's no need in the future for large ground forces. That view has been reinforced over time in Kosovo, quite frankly, Desert Storm in the air campaign, first phases of Afghanistan and Libya. So that is a belief system inside the Air Force. The Army believes that you can only do these things through ground action, being on the ground, affecting what's happening. The Navy is pretty much disinterested. If you listen to the discussion between the service secretaries a couple weeks ago that Sydney reported on, the Army and the Air Force say, we're going to do MDO, we're going to do MD command and control, which are really fundamentally different. And the Navy said, we're already doing this. Why are we having this meeting, essentially? So I think one thing I would recommend everybody as a doctrine writer, which is a very painful thing, read the other services' doctrines. Read their operating concepts, figure out what they think they're going to do, And how do you get to a joint consensus? And I worry that the biggest thing that's missing since the loss of Joint Forces Command is there is no one saying this is the joint concept and this is how we're going to nest into it.
Yeah, that's a good question. Do we need a joint forcing function organizationally, besides the chairman and the vice chairman, the secretary, who have a lot on their plates, a joint equivalent of General Murray, let alone a NATO equivalent of General Murray, to force everybody on board?
This is probably the most pressing challenge we have right now, I think, for the Joint Force is the need for a joint concept. Interestingly, this is the era that has become a forcing function, frankly, because if you look at air-land battle, our MO with conducting operations in air-land battle was to federate the capabilities of the services and then bring them together and synchronize them.
Right. There was a forward support coordinating line. There were areas where I fired, where you didn't fire, and vice versa.
And that would work. With multi-domain operations, first of all, it's happening far too fast. And the domains that you're dealing with transcend services, transcend echelons, and the speed with which you have to leverage them and converge them precludes a federated approach. And the challenge, I think, is to some degree our laws are such that we haven't necessarily empowered the chairman to drive a joint concept. So that's a bit of a challenge. And then with the dissolution of GIFCOM, we don't have a body or organization that has the capacity probably to do this. But ultimately, you're going to have to bring this. I think your counsel's good, Dr. Johnson, and that is to read the other ones, identify where the commonalities are, which can cause you to come together, I think, to a degree. Sir, you got anything?
Yeah, just a couple of comments. It's a great point because we've been talking all positives. There are some challenges, no doubt about it. I know what it's driven in Indo-PACOM, combatant command level, working a joint warfighting concept at that level is key. And for us, that it looks a lot, it's MDO, essentially multi-domain operations. But there's some other challenges that were touched upon here. Sydney and David touched on a few of them. The biggest challenge is, multi-domain operations command and control. You need a common operating picture in all domains, and we do not have that. And that's difficult. There are some things that are coming close. That's one of the keys, because it's tough as you're maneuvering. You've got to have a good common operating picture of where the assets are, what the layout of the land looks like, essentially, or you're kind of operating blind. Another one that I get hit up all the time from Admiral Davidson, the combatant commander, is the authorities. So as we're working this maneuver in multiple domains, and where does the buck stop on the authority to launch a long-range missile where maybe that individual doesn't have the sensor, it's from another service. So the challenge, there's some real challenges with that, but what we're saying is don't let that stop us from doing it. Let us keep working it, and we'll sort that out as you look at authorities. And just like with multi-domain command and control, we'll continue to get better options there. So those are a few more of the challenges, and I think that all gets to, if it's a joint operating concept, you eliminate some of those as you're working together even closer.
Dr. Johnson?
Yeah, so I think this is really analogous to what I talked in my slides. So you're the 12th Army Group out there in the Pacific figuring out how to do this, and there's no guidance from the institutions. Mm-hmm. Part of that's the way we've set up the COCOMs versus the services where they're trained, organized, and equipped now. But with that approach, we're going to have a EUCOM approach, we're going to have a PACOM, Indo-PACOM approach, and we're going to have even a Southcom approach, perhaps. So how do we get this where the institutions are driving the train, organize, equip function and providing conceptual guidance that is tempered by the experience in the field rather than everybody rolls around?
Mm-hmm. Mr. Wesley, is there an organizational model we're not seeing? Because we're all talking about these, these time-honored, COCOM, services, Title X, authorities. As you sort of have lived in the entrepreneurial world where people, don't have these big box org charts, is there a lesson there that we can draw for a way of organizing around this that doesn't require us to create, Joint Forces Command 2.0 with all the joy that involves?
So I'm gonna share a hard truth with all of you. We can talk about joint concepts. But what our adversaries are talking about is what we euphemistically call an interagency or whole of government approach. So Wagner Group, are any of you familiar with them? Russian paramilitary organization. They report both to the Russian premier as well as to MOI and their MOD. Huh, that's kind of weird. I wonder why they do that. The multiple Chinese organizations that handle information operations, they're not all flowing through some corps or some division or some command. Now, eventually they have touch points there, but they figure that out because, now candidly, they figured out because they had to. They had to because they both watched us. Remember my little stacked chart there? Yeah, with long-range precision strike and mobility, they watched with terror us do what we did in Desert Storm. And they responded because they had to. My concern for us is we have not yet had to respond because we have to.
Let me jump in here. I'm going to agree with that last point. And I think that, like I said, the era is a forcing function. The question is whether we'll read the tea leaves soon enough or it will result in disaster because we haven't changed quick enough. But let me challenge you on the concept. The concept is a concept because it's titled that. But a fine read, a detailed read of MDO 1.5, you will find, and I'll quote former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich, who said, this isn't an Army concept, it's not a joint concept, it's not a whole of nation or a whole of government concept, it's a whole of nation concept. That was a former speaker who read the document. And so if a detailed read would demonstrate to you that it's speaking to not only the senior leadership of the Army, DOD, the government, but our nation, goes to that issue of competition. And that's the whole of nation. Until our nation can understand the implications of not competing, which is something contrary to our culture, I think we're going to have a challenge.
That's a huge issue that goes well beyond, everyone on this panel, but we at least need to start working on some piece of that. This competition space. The U.S. has, and this has come up in a bunch of questions, and I'm sort of glomming them all together because I can't federate. I must converge. Is that we almost have a blind spot here. We think in terms of war and peace, and China and Russia think in terms of a constant struggle. War is politics, other means. Politics is war by other means. How the heck do you get the U.S. Legal and political systems beyond DOD to even sort of wake up to the problem? Which goes from, as people mentioned, stealing RIP, foreign graduate students who may be going right back to, working for security services or related industries and companies in the civil military fusion that China practices, all the way up to, little green men, Twitter, things that historically are, well beyond the purview of the Army, but certainly affect what the Army does. How does the Army bite off a piece of this and get everyone else to bite off their pieces?
So this is why I said earlier that I think this is the biggest strategic problem we face, because what you're suggesting, Sydney, or what we're suggesting, is this is going to require some cultural change. You pointed it out, that we tend to look at war and peace digitally. I oftentimes say, I think it comes from, particularly the United States, but Western democracies, this idea comes from our Judeo-Christian roots, that the origins of the nation, which resulted in a constitution, policy, laws, and culture that believes we're not a warfighting people, and that wars, in fact, are anomalies, and they are anomalies that have to be reconciled, and then you go back to what is the norm, and that is peace. As you point out, our peers look at a continuum of conflict, and they've identified our Achilles heel, and that is we require a very high bar to cross over into the conflict threshold, and they've mastered an ability to achieve their objectives left of that. So unless we're content with our most significant peers continuing to gain space in their operational and strategic objectives over the course of the next century, we've got to figure out how to get into this space. And some of it will be trial and error, some of it will be authorities, there will be costs associated with it, and I think it's going to be a significant challenge. The only way it'll change quickly is if there's a devastating war.
Yeah, I think the way you get to Sydney's question is through wargaming. And my background's in wargaming, full stop. So I'm a bit biased there. But I'll tell you what the Chinese have done. The Chinese have not fought a kinetic fight since 1979. 1979. So guess what they're investing heavily in? Wargaming that accurately models, and I'll sing praise for Dr. Johnson's organization. There's a great RAND study, if you haven't read it, studying what they call the will to fight, right, which is really the golden fleece of any kind of proper war game, beyond one that's, and then, by the way, this, of course, never happens, but ones that may or may not, try to justify force structure. But setting that aside, and wargaming is a foundation of the Chinese military. By the way, another thing that they're investing heavily in, the marrying up of artificial intelligence with wargaming, trying to accurately and asynchronously test their military in as real a situation as possible, using discrete technologies such as particle swarm optimization. This is happening right now because the Chinese are making a bet, and they're terrified that they say, you know what, unlike the United States, we've actually never been in a fight. And my concern with Newt Gingrich's assessment, beyond Newt Gingrich himself, is, I follow him on Twitter, and that's about it. My concern is that General Wesley is right. The problem is the rest of the government hasn't bought into that. Mm-hmm. Right? Who from the Department of Treasury or Department of State, even their internal reports, have declared them moribund. And by the way, they just got schwacked on the budget. So then we're going to go out there and say we're going to get a bunch of us, like me, a white guy, or the most white Mexican guy here, I guess, with the last name I have. They're going to get someone like me who's going to suddenly become a social media expert and try to conduct, disinformation against our adversaries come wartime. We're going to lose. We're going to lose just the same way we struggled in Iraq in 2004. What would we have? 1,000 wounded in action a month, 100 KIA a month, and then the response from the Secretary of Defense was, well, you go to the Army, you go to war with the Army you have, right? Well, I'd rather go to the war with the Army that we want, and I know we all do up here, but the challenge is I think we need to push ourselves harder as my slides poorly attempted to describe, in ways that we're not accustomed to. And by the way, I think we're doing that. So, kudos to General Murray and everyone else who already spoke, but we've got to do better.
So I think, reel this in a little bit. You're not going to change Judeo-Christian culture in the United States on the basis of constitutional norms, because that's not what your job is. What our job is to figure out what are the problems the nation is going to put land forces in to solve, and how do we deter these other states to, in fact, mobilize all these means in a different way than we do? Because we're not going to become them to defeat them. So the question is, what is the problem they pose? How do you deter it? And what do you need to do conceptually across the government to do those things? We know the whole of government literally is a whole. There's nothing in it. They're not battalions of ambassadors waiting at Foggy Bottom to deploy to be PRT leads. We found that out in the last 17 years.
Right.
So what is it the Army, who I believe provides the backbone for the joint force to do everything it's going to have to do, what is it going to have to do against these kinds of adversaries, and how are you going to adapt to that?
Just,
go ahead, sir.
Sorry, just one thing to add. It's not all doom and gloom here. I think with my 30-plus years in the Pacific, I've never seen such focused support, with the priority being China, and support across the board. And that goes for, when up on the Hill, both sides of the aisle understand the threats from China, and we're getting very, very good priority within Department of Defense as well. So I think it's not all doom and gloom, and there is a recognition of the need for this, for sure.
But are your State Department partners adequately funded to function? Your Treasury or Commerce functionaries able to, carry their demand, or do you end up with an Iraq-Afghanistan situation where the Army has to invent things because no one else has the capacity?
Yeah, way out of my lane. I wouldn't comment. I do get great cooperation with State Department and across the board, but I do think it's a great point by David. Whole of government needs some work, no doubt about it.
I want to caveat what you said, or come back at you, Dave. That is that, and Steve in fact. When you say that we're not engaging government or the government isn't accommodating the concept, that's what this dialogue's for. That's why we're here to debate it. That would be the first point. Second, you see the chairman doing it now. We saw this story on Project Maven, and I think you all saw in the news either yesterday or tomorrow, there's going to be an engagement between the chairman and Google. That's a good discussion. But absent it, I don't think it's sufficient for us to say that's not our job. In other words, part of the DOTML PF is policy. And the leadership of the Army need to describe what it will require to win. Yeah. Now, ultimately, decision makers will determine the degree to which those policies are adjusted. Our job is to describe how we will win. And then I think we do affect culture. We don't change culture, but we influence it and we shape it as well we should.
Right. Let's see. Now let me ask, this is the thread that we've run through here, and a lot of questions have been are about that I'm sitting on here. Artificial intelligence, or as we see sometimes, like with the safety feature on the Boeing Max causing it to crash, artificial stupidity, where the sum of software plus the human is less than the whole of its parts. You know, how can we exploit that, take advantage of that? But A, you know, without losing the advantage of our human beings, and B, without, you know, hitching our wagon to a horse that other people can steal, because AI is, you know, as Stephen said, this is all about software, and a lot of the, well, the data sets you can guard, but the algorithms themselves are out there. A lot of them are even open source. How do you exploit this when it's so very different from technologies we've dealt with in the past that were clearly a tool you could build, and you could not export, you have export controls, and you could train people physically on it, and it was, you know, this is a very different kind of tool that changes in your hand in many ways.
I'll start with, I believe there's no doubt, it goes back to what I talked about in the beginning, the fog of war now is overwhelming amounts of information. So certainly artificial intelligence, and by the way, it's been around a long time, washing machines use artificial intelligence, but as it continues to grow, the key is going to be artificial intelligence that helps human beings make decisions faster, that will weed through those, you know, haystacks of information, find you the golden needle. That will be a key decision. That will be critical. Of course, there'll be autonomous vehicles, there'll be autonomous systems, but this idea of it's going to all be autonomous and robots fighting robots, I don't see that happening. There's certain things AI will never be able to do, will never be able to have the empathy and in many cases the judgment required of a human being. That's not to say we don't take advantage of it. I think the biggest advantage will be making decisions in a more timely manner with better ability and fidelity on what all the aspects of it are.
Now, we had this discussion in Austin at South by Southwest a couple of weeks ago, which is a great place to have this conversation. You got a clash of cultures to a degree down there. One of the things that's important to note is the best decisions are going to come from a human in the loop. The best synthesis of context is with a soldier, and I just reinforce what General Brown's talking about, and that is this idea that ultimately on a hyperactive battlefield where you have exponential increase in lethality and the velocity of human behavior, you want to help the human in the loop synthesize that information much faster and more effectively. Some have said that, in fact, I've seen some of the counter views out in California are that if you empower soldiers with AI to make decisions, that they will believe that the AI is perfected and that it will make them more lazy in their decision making. And what I would tell you is we trust soldiers now to make good decisions with imperfect information. Why would we trust soldiers less with better information?
So I think this gets down to the fundamental policy issue that we need to address, which is who is going to make decisions or what is going to make decisions. And I think the needle in the haystack that the AOL will help you find, it'll help you find 3 million needles. And each of those right now, by policy for autonomous attack with lethal means, requires a human in the loop. So I worry it's actually going to slow down things in some ways. So I think it's not a either-or question. It's how do you parameterize the decisions that are routine, what we used to do with counterfire with dumb systems, which we still can do with counterfire with dumb systems. So how do we start thinking about this in a way that says there are some things that humans will not keep up with, and it will slow down what the response is. There are other things you definitely want the human involved in, about targets that are highly sensitive, about things that will affect where you're going.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
Yeah, I think that the thing that's going to kill all of us is data. The Chinese don't have this problem because the Great Firewall is not designed to keep all of us out. It's designed to keep all of their data in. This is the essence of the 5G discussion going on at the White House and why it's so important to dominate that space. So if you control the data, both data at rest and data in motion, then you have the opportunity to have AI. And let's quickly talk about what we mean when we say AI. So AI today, almost everything we talk about is what is collectively called, and for the record, I ran a venture-backed AI company before it was cool, unfortunately for me and the multiple I got when I exited. But the AI we talk about today is called weak or narrow AI. And you have to train the AI. How do you train the AI? You need data. You need data, which is why Clippy, when they resurrected Clippy, remember the old Microsoft? Well, actually, of course you guys do. This is an Armony audience. So Clippy, they rolled it out again, but this time it was AI-enabled. And within 18 hours, as you probably remember, it became a racist a-hole because it was responding to the audience feedback it was getting. So almost everything we talk about today is weak or narrow AI. The next step is called artificial general intelligence, AGI. AGI is where you don't have to train the AI. The AI just figures it out. That scares me, and of course the final step is what we call, or the third level is superintelligence, and at that point we have Skynet and none of us have any problems. So the reason why this matters is that if you say, okay, Steve, you're telling me I need to get all the data and I need to make sure it's secure, yeah, and then you have to figure out what you're going to share, right? Across the Army, across the Joint Force, across the whole of government, what are the tear lines?
Across partners, too, may have...
Partners, and many partners who are leading. Right now, there's a German and French coalition on AI, government to government, that they're currently partnered on AI co-development. And by the way, they actually have an AI national strategy. 19 other countries do. We had an executive order rolled out on AI, which is an executive order, not a strategy. And 19 other countries have strategies. I mean, a 200-page, the UAE has a 200-page strategy, probably designed by a management consultant, but nonetheless, 200-page strategy on AI. What are you going to do with the data? How are you going to employ it? How are you going to share it? These unsexy questions are what will determine who, as Putin said, who will dominate the world through AI in the future.
Now, I see that our time is running out, so let me ask, for each of you, a final thought, but particularly, on the human beings. As General Murray says, this is not so much about our generations, but about, the children and grandchildren who will be potentially fighting with these high-tech systems. How do you train the people for this kind of environment where, at one moment they may have amazing AI and visibility and network access, another moment they may lose all that? How do you train them to be adaptable, have initiative for that, and take advantage of that human advantage that's been so crucial to us in years past?
I think it's interesting that usually the old folks just need to get out of the way. This next generation is pretty incredible. And what I've found, the best ideas come from those closest to the problem on the cutting edge, and that has not changed. So they may be challenged with, maybe they're too reliant on technology, but they'll figure it out. They have, and I've seen it over and over again, numerous times, again, where lives are at stake. Incredibly creative, incredible agility, the ability to solve a complex problem in a timely manner. So I think often we've got to get the older generation out of the way, and how do you get those ideas from the bottom up is the challenge, the true best ideas, and not stifle them.
I'll share one thing, and that is one of the tenets we talk about is convergence, and an element of convergence is mission command. And before your eyes glaze over, which is the tendency, because we talk about it a lot, but as General Townsend has said publicly, we don't do it well. Mm-hmm. And so I think in this next large-scale ground combat event that will happen, we will see the need for mission command on a scale our generation has never seen. And so to get there, you know, we've got good doctrine. It talks about discipline initiative, it talks about trust. But I think one of the things we have to enhance is a willingness to take risk and underwrite risk. And that requires training events to exploit what General Brown just said, and that is to get out of the way and create conditions that force decisions that are contrary to what organizations have been told to do because they see opportunities that enable the formation, or force us to perform in an environment that's contrary to the automation that we may have.
So I've got steel knees, so it's really hard for me to get out of the way. But I think what we all have to do, our responsibility is to give tools to the soldiers of the future so they can do those imaginative, innovative things. Because without the long lead times of what Futures Command is trying to do and what MDO is fundamentally trying to do, they will have to figure it out on their own. And we've done that before, and I applaud the efforts that are going on in PACOM and AFC because there's a general recognition that we're not ready for the future. We're not going to do the future, the people at this table, but our decisions are going to provide the things that people can do that future successfully.
Mr. Rodriguez?
Right. The opportunity that we collectively, and I'm going to pull a Mike Gundy quote. I'm not 40. I'm a man. I'm 40. Right now I'm 41. I've got two kids, three and a half, and a 2-year-old, and one on the way. So, like Under Secretary McCarthy, I sleep very well at night when I do sleep. The reason why I'm bringing this up is I fully expect that none of them will need to learn how to drive. I mean, whereas I have buddies who have kids that are 7, 8, 9. Those kids will need to know how to drive a car. So these are things. General Mark Milley talking about. So I didn't get into the panoply of cool technologies that are coming, but he says one of the biggest things that excites him, and this is not the exact quote. I can pull it up later for you, but is self-healing materials. Like that's like we talk about this as that's going to be sometime down the road. That it's here now, and most of it is software enabled. And yet, what we have the opportunity to do is set the policies and the processes and the workflows. Workflows is a very unsexy thing, but most billion-dollar unicorn startups are actually workflow companies. If we can set the policies and the workflows, that will enable future generations coming quickly to maybe to help Dave get out of the way.
Thanks. And General, let me give you the final word.
Yeah, let me wrap this up a little bit because there are some sobering things that we've shared here. But let me just share a couple points, and that is, first, I think we are at an unprecedented spot, at least in the last 40 years, that we can be very confident in. That is, that the processes and organizations and views are in place to enable us to modernize this Army to the current and future operating environment on a scale or level that we haven't seen since the late 70s, 1980s. The organization, Army Futures Command, has stood up. The priorities from our senior leadership have been established. The resourcing has been increased, and we have a concept against an identified threat, all aligned at the same time. We should feel very good about the framework that's currently established. We just have to be diligent as we move forward to carry it out. And it will take 10 years and beyond to get to a position that we were in before. On Thursday, we've got a panel set up to talk about the Army modernization strategy. So if you're talking about that we want to see the pathway and the ideas that we are embracing across DOTML PF, not just technology and not just material design, that would be a good forum to go to. But I think, sir, we're in the right spot to move forward. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you. Gentlemen, let's have a hand for our great panel.
Well, thanks, Sydney, and thanks for the panelists for a very informative and sometimes provocative discussion, which I think is exactly what we're supposed to do. As a representative of the old farts generation, I think it's not sufficient to just get out of the way. I think we have a responsibility to set the path, set the azimuth, and enable those who come behind us to pursue many of the initiatives that were discussed today. So a great kickoff to the morning. We'll see you back here at 1:30, at 13:30, so plenty of time to visit the exhibits. Please go by the Innovators Corner and the Warriors Corner. We'll see you back here at 1:30. Thank you.